Most people believe they fall in love with others, but they rarely ask who or what is doing the falling. We imagine ourselves as the architects of our relationships, the conscious curators of attraction, compatibility, and affection. But Jungian psychology offers a far more unsettling truth. The ones we love are often reflections of the parts of ourselves we've never dared to face. We think love is a conscious act, but beneath the warmth of every romantic gesture and the pull of every magnetic gaze, something older is at work. Something unconscious, a silent architect, a hidden hand. And this is where our story begins. Not with another person, but with the unfamiliar parts of ourselves that guide every heartbeat, every longing, every repeated mistake. This journey isn't through city streets or candlelit dinners. It winds through the corridors of the unconscious mind, through shadows, projections, and archetypes that live just behind the eyes we think are ours. In this long-form reflection, Jungian perspectives on intimacy and connection, we explore the deep architecture of human love and the inner forces that shape our romantic fate. Through the lens of shadow work psychology, individuation, and the archetypes of intimacy, we'll uncover the emotional intelligence lessons buried within our relationships. Not just how we connect with others, but why we do what we do. If you've ever felt haunted by patterns in love you can't explain, if you've found yourself drawn to the wrong people, repelled by the right ones, or lost in the complexity of intimacy, this story is for you. Stay with me, because the truth about love isn't just out there. It's hidden inside you. And if this journey through the depths of the unconscious speaks to something in you, something unspoken, subscribe. This isn't just psychology, it's a return to the forgotten parts of your own story. I remember the first time I caught a glimpse of my shadow. I just ended another relationship, the fourth in as many years, and I was convinced it was them, not me. They were controlling. They were emotionally unavailable. They didn't understand me, but deep down, I felt the echo of something familiar, a pattern I couldn't shake, an ache I couldn't name. It wasn't until I discovered Jung's work, especially his ideas on the shadow self and projection, that I began to see the truth. The shadow, as Jung described it, is everything within us that we repress, deny, or disown. It's the dark twin of our personality, a reservoir of impulses, shameful desires, forgotten wounds, and primitive instincts that we pretend don't exist. But they do exist. And in relationships, they find a way to speak. That's the paradox of intimacy. The closer someone gets to our heart, the more likely they are to awaken our shadow. We see in others what we refuse to see in ourselves. We accuse our partners of being needy, manipulative, cold. But what we're really seeing are the disowned pieces of our own psyche. This is the mechanism of projection, a defense of the ego and a distortion of truth. Jung called it the most dangerous form of unconscious communication. It's not just misunderstanding, it's psychological sleight of hand. We cast our inner monsters onto the people we claim to love and then blame them for showing up. Imagine this. You meet someone new, they're magnetic, mysterious, intoxicating. You feel pulled to them, not by logic but by something deeper. And then it happens. The emotional high fades, the conflicts emerge, and the same old wounds resurface. You begin to wonder, why do I always end up here? The answer, Jung might say, is that the person didn't change. Your shadow simply stepped into the room. We long for connection, yet carry within us the seeds of its unraveling. We chase wholeness in another person, not realizing that what we're truly seeking is a reflection of the split within ourselves. Until we integrate the shadow, intimacy will remain a mirror, one that reflects not only love, but also the places where we are incomplete. To integrate the shadow is to reclaim our projections, to stop blaming our partners for our pain, and begin owning what we see in them. That's not easy. It requires self-awareness and transformation. It demands emotional humility and a kind of radical honesty most of us aren't taught, but it is also the path toward authentic connection. When we embrace our darkness, we stop expecting others to carry it for us. This is why shadow work isn't just personal. It's relational. Every time we bring light to our hidden self, we make room for deeper love. Not the idealized kind, but the real kind. The kind that survives conflict. The kind that sees clearly. The kind that heals. And so I began the work. Not with someone else, but with a mirror. I wrote down the traits that irritated me in my last partner and asked, where do these live in me? I didn't like the answers, but I needed them. They were the keys to a part of myself I had buried long ago. And in that excavation, something surprising emerged. Not just pain, but clarity, compassion, and eventually freedom. Shadow work psychology teaches us that the real relationship isn't between two people. It's between you and your unconscious. That's where love begins, and where it either grows or collapses. Next, we journey deeper into Jung's concept of individuation, where relationships become the crucible for our growth, and the unconscious mind, explained not as a passive force, but an active shaper of our destiny. Some people enter our lives to complete us, but others arrive to break us open. Jung called this individuation, not just a psychological process, but a kind of inner alchemy, a sacred undoing, the slow unfolding of who we were always meant to be. At first glance, it seems strange to speak of personal growth in the context of romantic love. We're taught to believe love is about closeness, comfort, and shared dreams. But what if the true purpose of intimacy was to reveal the parts of us we've never met and never wanted to? What if the person who breaks your heart isn't your enemy, but your mirror? Individuation is the process of becoming a whole individual, not a perfect one, not a fixed one, but a complete one. To individuate is to bring together all the fragments of who you are, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, and allow them to live in harmony. It is quite literally the path to the self, but this path is not walked alone. According to Jung, relationships, especially romantic ones, are crucibles for individuation. They challenge us, they push us, they confront us with our deepest fears, our need for control, our unhealed wounds. They hold up a mirror not just to our beauty, but to our brokenness. In this way, love becomes a spiritual fire, not a place to hide from ourselves, but a stage on which the soul performs its most difficult and honest work. Jung understood that we don't fall in love with others by accident. We're drawn to the people who carry the keys to our inner labyrinth. Sometimes they bring us joy, sometimes pain, often both, but always they bring a lesson. This is the paradox of intimacy. We seek safety in love, but love often brings disruption. Why? Because the unconscious mind, explained through Jungian psychology, is not interested in safety. It wants integration. It wants wholeness. And sometimes, wholeness requires us to dismantle the parts of ourselves that cling to illusion. Illusion about who we are, what we deserve, and how we're meant to love. Let me tell you something uncomfortable. The person who triggers you most in a relationship is likely your greatest teacher. They're not hurting you to be cruel. They're waking up the unhealed child in you, the rigid protector, the inner saboteur. That's why it feels so personal. Because it is. But it's also archetypal. You're not just having a relationship. You're reenacting a myth as old as humanity. Individuation asks us to stand at the edge of our emotional patterns and ask, what part of me is being revealed right now? What is this pain trying to show me? And most importantly, can I stay with it instead of projecting it onto my partner? The integration of opposites, a core theme in Jung's work, is vital here. We cannot become whole by denying the parts of ourselves we dislike. We must meet them, speak with them, even befriend them. Only then can we stop dragging them into our relationships like invisible luggage. In every conflict with a partner, there's a deeper dialogue occurring. One between your conscious self and the unconscious stories you carry. Stories of abandonment, of unworthiness, of control. But if we're brave enough to face these inner narratives, something beautiful happens. We stop asking others to complete us. We begin to complete ourselves. And yet, paradoxically, this inner wholeness allows for deeper connection. When we no longer need someone to be our missing piece, we can finally love them as they are, not as a fantasy, not as a savior, but as a fellow traveler on the road to authenticity. That's the secret. Individuation doesn't lead us away from love. It leads us back to it, but this time with eyes open, with a heart that's both full and fearless, with a soul that understands. Love isn't just about fusion, it's about freedom. So if you found yourself in relationship after relationship, wondering why you keep attracting the same type of person, ask yourself what your unconscious is trying to heal. Who are you really seeking in that other? Is it a partner or a part of yourself? Because the ones who hurt us most often speak the language of our shadow, and the ones who stay once we've done the work become companions in our transformation. The next time you find yourself falling for someone, don't just ask what they bring into your life. Ask what they awaken in you. That question could change everything. Next, we journey into the archetypal realm, where anima and animus live, whispering through our fantasies, our fears, and our desires. What do these inner figures teach us? They're about love, gender, and the masks we wear. And if you've made it this far, something tells me you're not here by accident. Maybe something in these words echoes a truth you've sensed but never spoken. If it does, leave a trace, a thought, a sign. The journey continues, and so do we. Somewhere deep within us lives a woman we've never met, or a man we've never spoken to, and yet they shape every relationship we enter. Jung called them the anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine archetypes that live in all of us, regardless of gender. They are more than symbols. They are magnetic forces, shaping how we love, whom we desire, and why we suffer. To understand the dynamics of intimacy, we must look beyond our outer relationships and turn inward to these archetypal figures that quietly choreograph our emotional lives. The anima and animus are not roles we play, but energies we carry. They are inherited patterns, ancient and universal, rooted in the collective unconscious, that vast, invisible reservoir of human experience we're all born into. The anima represents the feminine qualities within a man: emotion, receptivity, intuition, creativity, often repressed in a culture that prizes logic and control. The animus, its counterpart, is the masculine within a woman. Assertiveness, rationality, strength, direction, sometimes disowned in a world that rewards submission and softness. These figures do not remain buried. They seek expression. They live in our fantasies, our longings, and the people we're drawn to. When a man is mesmerized by a woman he can't explain, it may be the anima calling. When a woman feels pulled toward an idealized, distant male figure, the animus may be speaking. These are not just crushes. They are projections of our deepest internal energies, the unconscious reaching outward for integration. But here lies the danger. We often mistake these projections for reality. We don't see the person as they are. We see the anima or animus they activate in us, the idealized lover, the forbidden figure, the emotional savior. And when the illusion breaks, as it inevitably does, we're left with confusion, disappointment, even betrayal. Not because the person changed, but because the projection faded. This is the archetypal drama of love. We are not only falling for another, we are falling into ourselves, into the parts we've neglected or exiled. That's why relationships feel so charged, so transformative, so destabilizing. They awaken inner figures that demand our attention. But here's the beauty. Once we recognize the anima or animus in our relationships, we begin the work of integration. We reclaim our projections. We stop expecting others to complete us and instead cultivate the neglected energy within. A man who demonizes emotion can learn from the anima to open his heart. A woman who fears her own power can invite the animus to give her voice and direction. In doing this, we step into what Jung called psychological androgyny, the balanced soul. Not half a person seeking another half, but a whole being, capable of true intimacy because they no longer need another to make them feel complete. The interplay of archetypes, both within and between people, is profound. We are not just in relationships with individuals. We are in relationships with the myths they embody, the wounded healer, the wise old man, the trickster, the seductress, the lost child. When we ignore these forces, they control us. When we name them, they serve us. Ask yourself, who do I keep falling for? What archetype do they represent? What part of me are they activating, or rescuing, or avoiding? These questions are not merely academic, they are keys to your relational freedom. Jungian psychology shows us that the unconscious mind explained isn't just a storage unit of forgotten memories. It is a living theater, and every time you fall in love, you're not just meeting a person. You're encountering a character from your own inner drama. And if that sounds overwhelming, take heart. This is where transformation begins. When you stop chasing archetypes and start integrating them, you create space for real love, conscious love. Love that isn't blinded by fantasy, but illuminated by awareness. So if you're tired of repeating the same romantic story, look not at who you're choosing, but at why. What myth are you trapped in? And what inner figure is waiting to be acknowledged? Because until you meet your anima or animus, you will keep meeting them in others, over and over again. And every time you do, your unconscious will be whispering, "This is not about them, this is about you." In our next section, we go even deeper into the very mechanics of how our unconscious mind communicates in romantic relationships. Through tone, tension, silence, and instinct. Through unspoken fears and inherited stories, the unconscious is not quiet. It simply doesn't speak in words, and yet you've heard it, you've felt it, the pull, the trigger, the repetition, and maybe, just maybe, the invitation to finally understand. You don't always speak your desires, but your body does. Your silence does. Your choices do. In love, it's not just what we say that shapes our relationships, it's what we don't say. The unconscious mind, invisible and unspoken, is always communicating. Most people believe relationships are built on words, promises, plans, declarations. But Jungian psychology reveals something deeper. The unconscious governs more than we know. Every romantic dynamic, every argument, attraction, withdrawal, obsession, carries beneath it a current of unconscious energy. You've felt it, that moment when someone says all the right things, but something still feels off. Or when you're irrationally drawn to someone who doesn't match any of your stated preferences. That pull is not logic, it's not coincidence. It's the unconscious, explained not as metaphor, but as a living system, active, expressive, and determined to be heard. Our shadow, our archetypes, our unintegrated wounds, they all speak through the way we choose partners, the way we fight, the way we cling or withdraw. And if we're not aware of these forces, we become their puppets. We confuse old wounds for current problems. We mistake emotional flashbacks for legitimate threats. We think our partner is the enemy, when often they're just standing in the crossfire of our unhealed past. Let me be clear, this isn't about blame. It's about awareness. It's about seeing your patterns not as flaws, but as messages, calls from the unconscious, asking to be heard. Because the unconscious is a storyteller, and the story it tells, when left untold, repeats itself. Shadow work psychology helps us decode these patterns. It invites us to trace the emotion back to its root. Why does your partner's silence feel like abandonment? Why does their independence feel like rejection? Why does intimacy trigger your need to pull away? These aren't random feelings. They're echoes of the past. Childhood dynamics, cultural conditioning, ancestral trauma, all surfacing through the one thing we can't fake: connection. Jung believed romantic relationships often reawaken the earliest emotional templates. We recreate familiar roles: the rescuer, the victim, the pleaser, the critic. Not because we want to suffer, but because part of us believes we must return to the scene of the original wound to rewrite the story. But rewriting the story means recognizing you're in one. It means stepping back mid-conflict and asking, whose voice is this? Whose need? Whose fear? Sometimes the answer is painful, but always it is revealing. This is why self-reflection is essential in love. Without it, we become reactors, not creators. We lash out instead of leaning in. We perform instead of connect. We protect ourselves so fiercely that we never let anyone truly see us. But when we pause, when we breathe into discomfort instead of avoiding it, something miraculous happens. We begin to see our partner not as a source of pain, but as a participant in our healing. We stop playing out unconscious roles and begin writing new ones. We move from reaction to response, from reactivity to responsibility. And this is where true emotional intelligence lessons come into play. Emotional intelligence isn't about never feeling triggered. It's about recognizing the trigger, understanding its origin, and choosing not to hand it the wheel. It's about becoming conscious of your unconscious, especially in moments of intimacy, because the closer someone gets to our heart, the more they touch our history. The person we love most will often evoke the parts of us we've hidden: the scared child, the angry protector, the anxious lover. But if we can witness these parts instead of exiling them, we invite healing, we invite growth, we invite truth. And truth is the foundation of any meaningful connection. Not just surface truth, but soul truth. The truth of your patterns, your pain, your power, your responsibility. It's not easy, no one said it would be, but it's worth it. Because once you see your unconscious at play, you can't unsee it. And that awareness, that's liberation. That's love rising, not from fantasy, but from freedom. And if you're still with me, still listening, maybe part of you has already begun this work. Maybe part of you has felt it, stirring beneath the surface, ready to come alive. So let it. Mark this moment, speak it aloud, leave a trace, share a memory, comment below. Because what lives in silence can become a pattern, but what's named has the power to transform. In the next and final section, we rise above the unconscious, not to deny it, but to move through it, to make conscious choices in love, to build trust, vulnerability, and depth, not from projection, but from presence. This is where the healing becomes intimacy. This is where the journey ends or begins again. There comes a moment in every journey inward when the map ends. The unconscious has spoken, the shadow has been met, the archetypes have revealed their faces. And then something shifts. The question is no longer, what is driving me? But rather, what do I choose now? This is the threshold where unconscious intimacy gives way to conscious love. Most relationships live below the surface, driven by habit, chemistry, fear, or fantasy. But to rise above that, to build something that lasts, we must learn to connect not from longing, but from awareness. This is what Jung meant when he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Fate may bring people together, but presence, choice, is what keeps them there. Conscious connection begins the moment we stop relating to people through projections and start meeting them as they are. No masks, no archetypes, just two whole, imperfect, evolving beings, willing to witness and be witnessed, willing to see and still stay. That kind of relationship cannot be built on performance. It demands vulnerability, the raw, trembling kind. The kind that says, "This is who I am," when the shadow rises. The kind that risks rejection, not to manipulate love, but to invite it into truth. And here's the paradox. The more you accept yourself, shadow and all, the safer you make others feel. You create space for them to bring their whole selves to the table. No need to shrink, no need to pretend. This is what love becomes when it matures. Not a collision of fantasies, but a communion of realities. But what does this look like in practice? It looks like pausing in the middle of an argument and asking, "What am I protecting right now?" It looks like naming your projections. "I see I'm making you responsible for my fear of abandonment." Not to blame yourself, but to free both of you. It looks like choosing to stay, not out of dependency, but from conscious presence. "I see your flaws, and I still want to grow with you." This is not the fairy tale, it's something better. It's the real, and the real is what transforms us. Intimacy, as Jungian psychology teaches, is not just the merging of bodies or the sharing of dreams. It is the alchemical space where two unconscious worlds collide and either wound each other or heal. And healing happens through awareness, through ownership, through choice. When we begin to connect consciously, we stop demanding perfection. We stop expecting our partners to carry the weight of our unhealed inner child, our denied animus or anima, our need to be saved. Instead, we meet them from a place of fullness. We bring curiosity. We bring responsibility. We bring love, not as something we take, but as something we offer. And slowly something sacred emerges, trust. Not the kind built on obedience or fear, but the kind that grows from consistent truth, from being seen in your shadow and still held, from seeing someone else in theirs and still loving them. That trust is what allows relationships to deepen beyond survival into transformation, into connection that evolves with time, into partnerships that are not just emotionally bonded, but soul-aligned. Because when love is conscious, it becomes a portal. It changes you. It calls you forward. It reminds you again and again that the journey toward another is also the journey toward yourself, and that is the ultimate intimacy. So what do we do with all of this? We practice, we reflect, we speak the truth, especially when it's hard. We sit with our shadows and hold space. For theirs, we choose presence over perfection, and we remember love is not a reward, it's a mirror. And what it shows us, if we're willing to look, can set us free. You've walked with me through the mirror of desire, the fire of individuation, the myths of intimacy, the silence of the unconscious, and now into the light of conscious love. But this isn't the end. The unconscious lives on. The shadow still moves, and every relationship is another invitation to remember, to reawaken, to repair. So if this story stirred something in you, don't let it pass quietly. Leave a mark, speak your shadow, honor your archetypes. Share this story if it made you feel less alone. And when you're ready to dive even deeper, explore the next episode in our Jungian psychology series, linked just below. Because love isn't just something we feel, it's something we become. And the more we understand why we do what we do, the more we can choose how we love and who we become in the process. Until then, stay conscious, stay curious, stay connected. See you in the next video.